it's a little out of my price range. Oh, we're live.
Yes, we just went
That's
live,
another
so
book that's expensive.
let me say welcome to Hangout 11, everyone.
Hooray!
Good to be here.
I have to use the facilities because I didn't expect to start as early as I did, so I'm going to be right back.
What a host you are.
I know, I say go live and then I leave, right?
I don't know if he wants us to wait. If you want, Wayne, we can talk about what you had planned. Unless John did want us to wait. I don't know.
I don't know either.
Yeah, I think we should wait for him.
Anyone
So is
got
everyone
any
okay?
other good jokes? Any good punny jokes?
Why do Jewish men make coffee? Because he brews.
That's a good one. Haven't heard it.
I let that one in back in my seminary days.
We're back.
Trying to think of another joke I know. Have you heard the one about the priest who gets to heaven and he asks Jesus if he can see the original copies of the Gospels? And Jesus says, yeah, sure, absolutely, and shows him like the original copy, and he breaks down in tears, and Jesus is like, what's the matter, like, my son, why are you crying? And the priest says, because it says celebrate, not celibant.
Okay.
Sorry, I would have laughed, but I actually wasn't listening because I was talking to somebody in the room with me.
That's okay.
I missed the joke. Sorry.
No worries.
I heard I missed a really good discussion on Marcion.
Just jokes.
What hangout was it that Shauna was discussing Marcion? I don't know who she was discussing with.
That was with me. She was probing my master's thesis and some of the things I had to say. It was actually a impromptu Bible Geek .5 episode, which I got randomly invited to, and yeah.
Yeah, I was only able to stay for part of that, unfortunately. The good stuff happened after I left, apparently. As it usually does.
It was a bit weird because I was just like, oh, you know, well, no, actually, Doug was curious what my background was, and that got me talking about Marcion, and Sean had propped up and was like, oh, talk to me about Marcion. So that's on my blog if people want to see someone was kind enough to make a shortened version of it. So I'll just get the link for that and haul myself out shamelessly.
Welcome, Johannan.
This is your blog?
Yeah, that's my blog.
I'd love to read your thesis when you're done, if that's possible.
Yeah, I'll share it with you when it's done over the Hangouts. I'm still fine-tuning it, and I'm working on another major research paper for another assignment, which is to do with the practice of epipasm in 1 Corinthians. So circumcision in reverse. Very fun topic.
Reverse?
Oh yeah,
Uncircumcision?
epipasm is the practice of attempting to undo one's circumcision. It seems that's what some of the more Hellenized Jews practiced, at the time of the Maccabees and other parts, to become more Hellenized and to associate. Bruce Winter thinks it's got a lot to do with social mobility within the ancient world, attempting to climb the social ladder. I am using socio-historical criticism, so I'm looking a lot at honor-shame, because one of the things that I find fascinating about circumcision is that it's dead smack in the middle of honor-shame. It's one of the most honorable things, the most beautiful things, one of the most significant things in the life of the Jewish male and the life of Jewish theology and spirituality, but to the Greco-Roman world, and it's mutilation, it's horrifying, it's the butt of like jokes. So right there, it's that big crosshair. So that's what one of my papers is focusing on.
You know that's practiced even today.
Epipasm, yeah.
We're probably better at it today, I'm guessing, though.
Oh yeah, there's a first century physician, Celsus, who has a giant medical dictionary, and in chapter 25 he explains how to do it. Yeah, it's really funny because at the end of the prescription, at the end of the surgery, he advises medical practitioners bathe in pure water, relax, and avoid excitement. It uses like those words, like avoid excitement.
Well, that would be a
Just
fun
send them right to a Bible Geek Hangout there. That's one way to avoid excitement.
So, John, did you want to go over that Mark stuff, or
No.
or you don't want to? Okay, because Wayne had
Yeah, I want other people to go ahead before that with whatever they want to talk about.
Yeah, I do, Doug.
Oh, thanks for that link, Daniel. I'll check those out.
I have access to a lot of theses through the university I'm attending. I don't know, is it EBSCOhost or something like that?
Yeah, EBSCO's great.
Yeah. Is it available through that too? Do you think I could get it through there?
My thesis isn't done yet. It's due for submission on the 1st of November. So that's when I have to have it done. At the moment, I've got about a few pages to go, and then I've got for the next 2 weeks, I'll be going through with the fine-tooth comb, making sure I'm not misquoting people, or that my arguments are as strong as they can be. So, yeah, that's eventually it will be up somewhere, and if people want to read it at some point, they're more than welcome to. But yes, and then I've got to start practicing for this really interesting GRE exam that you Americans love.
What university are you attending right now?
I'm associated with the University of Newcastle and the Australian Catholic University. So they're my two universities.
Gotcha.
And then I cast the net into the American world.
Oh, thanks, DM. I'll check that out too. I'm just downloading all of Daniel's papers.
Oh, geez, you're going to make me blush.
Well, don't blush until I read them and tell you what I think of them. Even though you know way more than I do, so don't worry.
As it says on my blog, I do what I do because I'm interested in learning, creating dialogue, and engaging with big ideas. And I am happy to be proven wrong, and I'm happy to learn new things. In fact, I don't know if you guys follow Bart Ehrman's blog, but he did a really good post the other day about on changing one's mind. And he talked about some of the things he's changed his mind on, why he did, and just that whole process of that academic engagement in changing someone's mind. It was really good. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was like a really nice, humbling read. I'll see if I can find it.
I wonder if he's tilling the earth for his upcoming announcement as a new convert to the Christ myth theory.
Well, I bought DM's book yesterday. Was there a historical Jesus of Nazareth? Because I wanted to see the overlaps between her take on the Midrashic creation of the story in the Gospels compared to Dr. Price's. So I haven't read it yet, but I do have it now.
Cool. That sounds interesting.
So I threw a link in there if anyone's interested. And the rest of you can search on Google.
Oh, is the text of this book contained within the that book, the rebuttal book?
I would say yes. But that's all right. I don't mind spending the money again. Not 99 cents. The price is right. Yeah, I would highly recommend Bart Ehrman and the Quest of the Historical Jesus book. Definitely a good read. I was really surprised about the erudition of the articles in that book.
Are you being facetious?
No, honestly.
You're talking about Ehrman's book.
No. I'm talking about the rebuttal book that DM's talking about.
The rebuttal book. Okay, yeah.
Bart Ehrman and the Quest of the Historical Jesus. Not Did Jesus Exist by Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, even historicists thought that Ehrman's book was kind of a disappointment.
Weak.
Yeah.
I liked it, but I'm gonna...
I read it based on its reputation, but now I feel like I want those hours of my life back.
Daniel, what's
Got
your
my finger on the eject button.
Daniel, what's your view on the Christ myth versus historical Jesus?
Okay.
What kind of a historicist are you? Let's say that.
Okay. All right. To begin with, one of my papers has engaged with mythicism, particularly Richard Carrier's book, because it's a peer-reviewed book, and while most people will probably not give it the time of day, I think that the fact that Sheffield Phoenix published it says a lot, and the fact that people donated to the project says a lot about where particularly the atheist skeptic community is at. So people who are biblical scholars and historians of Christian origins should engage with this. If people find this interesting, there should be engagement. So I want to make that clear. I don't want to be antagonistic about this. However, I find the whole view highly problematic for many of the reasons why Ehrman, Casey, Hoffman, and others have brought up, that I don't really feel like the need to bring it up. I think the evidence, not so much the evidence, but the arguments have been made, and at this point it becomes very circular, and I just don't think that's really fruitful dialogue, especially in what I feel like this community is a very friendly and engaging community. So I want this to be friendly and fruitful. But more than anything, I classify myself as what would be called a Jesus minimalist, I guess, is the title I like. I really quite liked what Joseph Hoffman said in his article on not finding the historical Jesus, I think, in the book, the one that was published by Prometheus as a part of the Jesus. Anyway, he had a big thing about that. All we could really know about Jesus is that he was some dude who got crucified, probably had a brother named James, had a few followers, and that's about it. It's like a paragraph in length of what we could know, and that's about it. When I started to give up on my faith, I found the Quest for the Historical Jesus very fascinating, and N.T. Wright, John Dominic Crossan, all those guys, the big monstrous books, John P. Meyer, Marcus Borg, I wanted to just engage with them so much. But the more I read them, the more I saw problems in the methodology, problems in the conclusions, and I just found lots of the arguments just overreaching. And in the end, I just think what Paul probably gives us is about the best we're going to get. That he probably had a brother named James. He was understood to be the anointed one by his followers, and they believed he was raised from the dead. Beyond that, I think the rest is speculation and theology.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was gonna say, don't worry, not everyone in these hangouts is a Christ mythicist. So, but obviously, considering it's a Bible Geek hangout and it's associated with Dr. Price, there's obviously a higher representation than the average in here. But we had Tim Widowfield in last week, and he's pretty much agnostic on the Jesus of history or lack thereof too. So, and he in fact said that he said that he finds a lot of the arguments circular as well. So that we have a mix of people in here, so you're not going to have anybody.
One of my ultimate concerns is that in terms of Jesus mythicism versus historicism, is that it sort of becomes just people just talking at each other, that it's two different sort of fundamentalisms sometimes. Like, I'm not saying people in this group, but no one's willing to give an inch, no one's listening to each other, there's no real dialogue, and that the only way the conversation can go is if somebody wins. And I can understand why historicists get frustrated by some mythicists, and I can understand why some mythicists get frustrated by historicists. So it's I just don't think these sorts of things have to be as antagonistic as the internet culture we live in breeds them to be.
Yeah, I think the topic just is even amongst non-believers, the topic tends to be one that lends itself to passionate opinions in a lot of cases. So. But anyway, yeah, I was just curious. I have a habit of asking everybody that question.
It's fine. It's actually one of the, if I do get around to writing a popular book, it's something I would like to engage with, because so many people were disappointed with Ehrman's appeal. It's actually something where it's like, well, and also the fact that it was published before Carrier got in the ring.
Yeah.
With this big book, it's one of those things where it's like, well, maybe this is my chance to jump in the ring and defend the historicity of Jesus, but on the same time, point out some of the more dubious aspects of the quest for the historical Jesus. I quite like Dr. Price's quote that even if Jesus did exist, which I think he did, the image of him has shrunk behind the stained glass. And I agree with that. Hence why I like the term minimalist. I just don't think we can know as much as someone like John P. Meyer, who's writing 5 fat volumes on what we can know about Jesus. I just don't think we can talk about with that sort of certainty. But that's an idea.
I don't think you can trust anything that if it's behind the stained glass, as you say. I think that puts into question every single aspect of it, including the minimalist amount of information.
One thing Dr. Price often says is he just finds the Christ myth theory to be the most likely. You know, he always says he holds it tentatively, but based on, you know, what he's researched, he finds it to be the most likely. I almost want to say merely the most likely, but it's a little more than merely, I think.
It's one of the reasons why I really admire him, and there's many reasons. He's a great guy to listen to. He's just very easy to engage with. His books are a delightful read. I know this sounds like fanboy sucking up, but when he talks about the Christ myth theory, even he admits its limitations. Even he admits its strong points, its weak points, its more interesting points, and I admire that. I admire that in a scholar who can take a hard look in the mirror as well as the rest of the world, and it's one of the reasons why I really admire Price's work.
A few years ago, I wouldn't have even accepted that Christ myth theory. It was kind of, I thought it was counterintuitive, but I came to, at least as a minimalist position, is that I would like to see it taken seriously as a scholarly interpretation of the evidence, not necessarily that it's true and historical Jesus is false, but rather I would like to see it move from the fringe Holocaust denial type considerations that it has in a lot of circles and move into something that has a lot more, is given a lot more credibility and is seriously discussed. I mean, there's no way you can actually make any headway in these issues unless you have some serious discussion, scholarly discussion about it.
Yeah, and that's, if I did sit down to do the work to write a book, it's something, you know, I would like to do. Yeah, so engage it, refute it, intersect it, take on the good parts, all that sort of stuff. But that's, you know, that's a project for after the Master's Feast.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the title of Dr. Price's book was The Christ Myth Theory and Its Problems.
Oh yeah, and that in itself, you know, is really great. I love his section on James where he just talks about, well, you know, the Achilles heel of the Christ myth theory is James, but maybe not so. Let's take a look. And I really enjoyed that, like the fact that he with his own scholarship that way. Yeah. Man, this is just a big fanboy session.
My favorite part of that book was Jesus at the Vanishing Point, which was actually a separate article that was incorporated in that book.
Yeah, that was part of his chapter for 5 perspectives on Jesus with Crossan was one. Trying to think who else.
It dealt a lot with the Jesus seminar.
Mm.
How he thought that the voting on the authentic sayings of Jesus, that they should have all been black.
Yeah, that whole process was just very interesting. Very, very. How they came up with such a concept to me, a methodology to me, it's very interesting. And I read an interesting article about it saying that it was such a sort of 90s way to handle things, like that sort of zeitgeist of the time, particularly with the media and all that sort of stuff.
Well, after reading the 5 gospel parallels, I came to the conclusion that the pinks were pretty much red. In other words, that they, you know, just had a few dissenters that swayed it a little bit towards the maybe side. But for all intents and purposes, you could pretty much take most of the pink sayings as being red. And in the book they were blue, but I guess they were considered gray in the voting. The gray probably would be like the opposite, where they were pretty convinced that it wasn't, except for a few dissenters that swayed the statistics of it. So that's basically what I got out of reading the commentaries and so forth, and about the methodology of the Jesus seminar.
Didn't they find Wayne asked, David asked, has there been any new archaeological / empirical evidence since the days of Schweitzer? And I thought there was some kind of church they discovered somewhere, I think it was in Galilee somewhere, that had like an inscription with a super high Christology, like a prayer toward Jesus, our God, or something like that. But I don't remember what the dating was or even when it was discovered. It may have been discovered pre-Schweitzer, I don't remember.
The most recent piece of art found, I believe, which hit the news a while ago, was it's definitely not contemporary Jesus stuff, but it's interesting that Jesus is holding a book in the art piece, which is a very interesting sort of the development of canon when Jesus starts holding books and things like that.
Forgery.
Someone in the comments have just talked about the James ossuary. Yeah, the council's pretty much out on that one. That was a hoax, a forgery.
Yeah. As far as I'm aware, there's only like a few fundamentalists still claiming that it's real or that it's genuine.
And Simca, the naked archaeologist. Although I don't know why he calls himself an archaeologist.
I really need to read that book, Renee Salm's book, about whether or not there's evidence that Nazareth was populated at the beginning, like the first few decades of the first century.
Oh, did Nazareth exist? The myth of Nazareth.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I would like to read, if there is such a thing, a book that has the opposite opinion, and then see what I think of the two arguments.
I will send you a paper right now.
Okay, cool.
So one of my professors at my old university is doing a lot of archaeological work around Nazareth, and he has quite a bit to say.
Man, I have so many PDFs that I'm not complaining, by the way. I'm happy I have so many PDFs of papers, and someone sent me a really cool, I think it may have been you, Wayne, or David, someone's doctoral thesis, James Barker, called John's Use of Matthew, and I've got a ton of these to read, so I've got my reading cut out for me, which is making me happy, not frustrated. DM said she's having trouble getting her mic working, so I think that's why she left.
I was hoping she'd be here for my presentation.
I think she is coming back, yeah. She's trying to get her mic working.
Yeah, even so, though, she's been active in the chat, so...
Yeah. I thought I'd go back and read some of her stuff if she can't get her mic reading, just so that it's on the record, so to speak, because otherwise it won't show up.
So are we talking about the endings of Mark, or is this sort of just a free roll?
We're just, whenever John feels like talking about it, pretty much. We're always waiting at the beck and call of John Felix, essentially.
Yeah, right. You guys could go on without me, no problem.
Anyway, that doesn't sound like...
You've got all the materials, right? I already gave you the 3 PDFs I was going to talk about anyway, so who needs me?
Well, we want your opinions.
I say, oh, Rabbi, lead us.
No, I just didn't want to hog it up with what I wanted to talk about. I thought I'd leave it open to see if anybody else wanted to deal with anything else before I wanted to go off live anyway, talk about it, because then I don't look like an idiot in public.
So you just decided to throw me, the historicist, into the mythicist den of lions.
It took me hours to get this group together of rabid mythicists.
I'm the token historicist. That's an interesting change of pace for people, I'm sure.
Yeah. Maybe you should just be quiet and sit at the back.
Very tempting.
Well, you know, like Dr. Price, well, maybe he doesn't say it, but I know some people say it, that they're not married to the theory. Like, I don't know, I think we mentioned this last week. There was all of a sudden that fake historian guy that he had mentioned seeing Jesus of Nazareth personally raise a stillborn baby from the dead. And not knowing that it was a satirical site, you know, I took it seriously, but, you know, it's not like I immediately rushed to find everything I could to demolish it. You know, I was sincerely interested in seeing if it was valid, first of all, so I spent a lot of time looking around to see if I could find anything else about it. But only one site carried it, so it began to look suspicious to me. But still, I spent like an hour of my time looking into it, and it's not that, you know, it was more like, oh boy, finally something that can actually prove historicity. You know, I would welcome something like that. That would be cool. You know, so I wouldn't immediately want to join the debunking bandwagon on anything like that.
Oh yeah,
of course, yeah.
It's one of those things that I tell people, as an agnostic atheist, like, it's like I'm not married to historicity as well, and people pressure me about this. I couldn't care less. It just, that's the way, it goes for me, I'm afraid. But I'd love some concrete evidence that goes both our ways, more so for me and for you if you turn out to be right,
Yes, I want to be open to it, especially the evidence. And that's, to me, that's the bottom line, is what more does the evidence points. As many historical Jesuses as you can think up, as many mythical Jesuses as you can conjure up. But it boils down to what is the actual evidence, what is the status of that evidence, and hopefully there'll be some more someday.
There's a saying in the philosophy of science that evidence is theory-laden. That, regardless of what the physical evidence is, it's always interpreted in light of other theories we've had that are based on other evidence we've experienced. So a lot of the differences come down to that. Like, I don't think the James, the brother of Jesus passage is all that convincing at all. I think there's just too much evidence in the Christian tradition of talking about other Christians as brothers in Christ. And I don't think that passage has enough to say that it's an exception to that rule. But other people disagree with that, and they brought up some arguments that are, I don't know if they're good or not. Some people think they're good.
Yeah, as everyone says, they've read various treatments of that. I personally still have problems with that. I still think that that's a very strong case for historicity, but I'm willing to admit that it's debatable. The point is not debatable. It's not an iron shut kind of thing. So, but I'm still not fully convinced that the arguments so far have swayed me on that issue. But that's because maybe I'm just being hypercritical or something. But that's where I stand on the James issue, the brother of the Lord issue. However, I do doubt that the Josephus information is authentic.
Well, I don't think anybody thinks that's. Are you talking about the whole kit caboodle?
Well, specifically when he mentions that
James
Jesus is the brother of James, yeah, because I don't think he's referring to the Gospel James or any of the other Jameses there might be, but rather James, son of Dionysius, who is the subject of the entire section anyway, or a part of it anyway.
Yeah, that's Josephus is a bit. It's one of those things that I think one of the problems is people assume too much. and particularly from their own knowledge, where it's just like, oh, I know what Josephus says, but I don't think enough people actually stop to read Josephus themselves. So I catch quite a few people out in that, where it's like, well, hold on, like let's actually open up Josephus' little thing on John the Baptist and Jesus and James, and let's see what the actual text says.
Yeah, a couple hangouts ago when Dr. Price was, and we discussed for a short period of time the historicity of John the Baptist and his mentioning in Josephus, what that meant. But there was something that was brought up that I wanted to bring up to the attention of the group because it was discussed in podcasts a long time ago, and that a lot of the apologists are trying to salvage part of the Testimonium Flavianum as being authentic, based, I think, on the Arabic, or was it the Slavonic, just some of that other one stuff. So they came up with a minimal Testimonium.
It's the Arabic one that holds the minimal.
Right, okay. I thought I had correct information there. But anyway, it's talking about, you have to remove certain things. You can't have...
Testing. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes,
Oh,
we
you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I just had the wrong setting all this time. Silly me. Hi.
Hey.
How you doing?
Hello, great to have you here.
G'day.
I don't seem to know any of you. Have we been properly introduced?
Well, you know me, right?
Who?
John Felix.
Oh, John. Hi. I don't know your
How
voice.
you doing?
Okay.
No, we've never actually spoken that I know of.
No. Doug, you, do I know you from somewhere?
Nope, don't believe so. I'm just a random Bible Geek listener.
I see. Okay.
I'm Wayne Denvertisen. I'm a fan of you on your Facebook page, but I haven't really interacted with you that much there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Nice to meet you, Wayne. Okay.
I only know you by reputation, I guess.
Well, please don't listen to Bart Ehrman.
Oh, you have a few sources out there that I've learnt about a few of your works through. I think I watched a YouTube video with you once by accident. Yeah.
That's good. Well, at least you have some exposure. Well, it's interesting. This is my first Hangout, so it's pretty intimate group here.
It's only like my third or fourth Hangout, so it's comparable.
This is only my second, so baptism by fire.
Except for myself and Doug, there's pretty much been various people. Well, Reuven, of course, because he's here as our moderator behind the scenes.
Yeah, we get people coming in and out here. Like as I was saying last week, we had Tim Widowfield from Breeder. We even had Matt Slick from carm.org in here a few weeks ago. Dr. Perez has joined us a few times. I saw Herman Dettering actually said he was going to try and come tonight, but I don't know if he's going to make it.
DM?
Yeah.
Do you have headphones?
I do. I'm listening.
Oh, okay. Somebody else then is giving us feedback.
Oh, what are you hearing?
I'm hearing an echo of all the audio in the chat.
That's weird.
I'm hearing an echo of all the audio.
I'm using headphones.
Might not be you, but it might be somebody else.
Well, I can try muting it for a second to see if it goes away.
Let's test. I still hear the echo.
Yeah, it's somebody
I had
else.
it muted, so it's not me.
Yeah, it's not you.
I do have cartoons in the background, though.
Maybe that's it. It's not bad.
Cartoons?
For me, it's not bad.
It's not the cartoons. It's actually our voices being echoed.
Oh, okay. Okay. I don't know who that is. Somebody with a microphone, though, then.
Definitely.
Yeah, I have a headset.
We got two Daniels in here. Is he echoing himself?
That was a possibility because he probably crashed. Well, he did crash.
He's very young.
Anyway, yeah, we do this every week, Tuesday nights, and we it's usually pretty free form. When Dr. Price is in here, we'll just get a bunch of people to ask him questions, essentially.
Well, it would be nice to have him in here. I haven't spoken to him in a while. I've been in a few programs with him, if any of you've heard our shows together.
Yeah, I've seen several of them.
I mentioned to him in an email earlier that it was happening tonight, so if he's not busy, he stops in, but he's working on like 19 books at once or something.
Yeah, some of us probably know that feeling too. Pretty grueling stuff. Like right now, I've been trying to wrap my head around whose books on Mark, ebooks or PDFs are these?
I posted them. One is by what's this? Delbert Burkett. It's 11-page section on his idea that the ending of Mark is authentic and why. And then I posted 2 other PDFs from the United Bible Society based on the work of Bruce Metzger, which argues for the inauthenticity.
Mm-hmm.
How many syllables is that? Inauthenticity of the ending and why it's marked off in brackets in the United Bible Society's. Well, I have the 4th Greek edition, but I think the 5th is out right now.
What's the consensus here? I think all the New Testament is inauthentic. So.
Well, I definitely don't think the long ending of Mark is authentic.
Yeah, I would go with inauthenticity. Even after reading Burkett's arguments 4, I could see a lot of holes in them. So that's some of the things I wanted to go over with the group at some point. It's just going over the argument.
Well, to me, it always comes back to, even if we are nitpicking details in Greek and all of this, it always comes back to the motifs appearing in pre-Christian mythology, and by that criterion, they are not historical elements, and therefore they would be added as patchwork. So the fact that this is such an intrusion in some of the texts is indicative to me that it was an afterthought for that particular community. They probably heard it from somebody. Oh, hey, that sounds good. Let's throw the resurrection motif in here. Boom.
Yeah, even though that Metzger and those people realized that some of the earliest manuscripts do have it, they still considered that as not a valid reason for including it, because it just doesn't seem to fit.
But the earliest manuscripts, by that you mean from the 4th century?
Right, yeah. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus don't have it.
Well, they have this one mention in here of the Diatessaron, which made me bring up my analysis of that, which is pretty lengthy. And my conclusion is that it's not necessarily a separate text. It may have been based on the Gospel of the Hebrews. Tatian may not have. It's not necessarily a harmony of the 4 Gospels, and it doesn't indicate that they were in existence when it was written.
Oh, that's where I was reading that. I could not remember where I was reading that. I should have favorited it or something, but I could not remember where I read that. That was a great discussion.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you read it, because a lot of people, it's pretty much over the heads of the masses. But
yeah, I can't name anybody who has read it.
Yeah, well, it was being tossed around by the Jehovah's Witnesses, and as evidence for the early existence of the Gospels, because if it's in harmony of them, then they must have preceded it. And so I sat down and went into pretty good detail in analyzing it, and my conviction is that Marcion was first, the Gospel of the Hebrews existed first, and this Diatessaron may be based on the Gospel of the Hebrews, which may have been used by Justin Martyr, not the canonical Gospels, and that Justin Martyr's quotations, because they don't really match up with any of the Gospels, may come from the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is also what he may have called the memoirs of the apostles. The memoirs being like the Acts, it's a single text and not reference to the Canonical Gospels. So that's my take.
You know, I was reading Larry Hurtado's blog, I think it was a couple weeks ago, and he had this big post about the quotes that you were talking about, and how they're so much different than what we have. And he had this whole big thing about how they were just paraphrases of the gospel. So he actually did have our gospels, our versions, but he was just paraphrasing all the quotations.
Yeah,
that's why they're so different.
Right. I mean, acknowledging that they're different, and then suggesting that they would be so heretical as to ignore the originals and just, come up with the Justin Martyr version. It's just there really is no evidence for. I've looked long and hard, and I've noticed that Dr. Price came recently. Well, not so recent, but in his New Testament translation, he basically agreed with me that, I'm not saying just me, but that my position that the Canonical Gospels are a later 2nd century composition and post Marcion. That's he actually wrote that in his new Nicene New Testament.
Pre-Nicene New Testament.
Yeah, that big fat book he's got. So I'm seeing there's a little bit more tendency to be more critical of accepting these earlier dates, even the conservative dates that are put within the 1st century. Obviously, Mark is really important to this whole discussion, but I'm wondering, you had a Marcion conversation previously, and I've always been very curious about the connection between Marcion and Mark, and also an Lucas, proto-Luke. And I noticed that, where was that page? The first New Testament by Bidune, is that his name? Jason Bidune?
Yeah.
Okay, well, in that, I haven't read it, but it looks like something I need to look at.
I started reading it, and I like it a lot.
Yeah, well, it sounds like something up my alley, because he says, explores the impact of Marcion, I'm assuming, in this summary on Amazon.
Have you read?
Yeah, impact on the study of Luke Acts, which is my take is that Luke Acts, the author had Marcion in front of him. But anyway, go ahead.
I'm assuming you're already familiar with Paul Louis Couchot's old article called the first edition of the Paulina.
I personally don't know that one. Is that Couchot? Is that the? He also was a. What did he write? Ecce Homo? No, that's a different guy.
It's probably the same Couchot you're thinking of, I think. He's a French writer.
Let's see.
The text I just mentioned is available in translation from. I forgot the guy's name. Anyway, I linked to it last week.
Pierre Couchot, philosophy professor in the 1920s.
That's about the right time period. I don't remember if he was a philosophy professor.
Paul Louis.
Yeah, Paul Louis Couchot.
Yeah. I was thinking he wrote Ecce Homo, but that's not him, maybe.
He also wrote some Christ myth stuff, so that's why I thought you'd be more familiar.
Yeah, that's
with
what
it.
I'm thinking of. Yeah, he's one of the few people I've not investigated very.
But anyway, his article, the first edition of the Paulina, basically compares Harnack's reconstruction of the Apostolicon with the canonical Catholic version, and the Catholic version is like about a third longer. That's been well known for a long time. The Church Fathers said that was because Marcion had removed a lot of it, but Paul Louis examines that claim, looking at several passages, and comes to the conclusion that the canonical version has to be derivative from Marcion's version.
Aha. Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, it's
It's
actually
accreted rather than excised.
what's interesting is a lot of the early accusations against Marcion isn't so much to do with his tampering of textual stuff, but he's accused of corrupting the gospel and
Right.
the gospel and things like that. But in some of the earlier stuff, there's not a lot of mention of his actual literary sort of tampering with things.
So the accusations grew in scope in later periods. Because
It's a little bit unrelated. Like, my study has been his relationship with Gnosticism, and if there is a connection, which I don't think there is, but like the actual biblical canonical growth under him has been really very interesting. Particularly, we were talking about before, Tyson's book, Marcion Luke Acts, where he claims that Luke Acts is actually a reaction against Marcion, that Acts presents Peter and Paul on a united front, and the other apostles united to prove against Marcion and his claims that they were against one another, and Paul was the true spiritual apostle. And Acts says, no, see, they're all friends and brothers. And also, interesting, some of the geography that Tyson mentioned is against the geography of Marcion, that Paul goes nowhere near geographically the places that Marcion is associated with. So basically what Luke is doing, according to Tyson's argument, is inventing a canonical history which fundamentally proves that Marcion's a heretic who gets all of this stuff from the devil, so to speak, and has absolutely no correct connection with Paul and the Gospels. Interesting theory. Not sure if I buy into it 100%, but it's very interesting to read. Highly recommend it.
The book by Crucial I wanted to get was The Creation of Christ, an outline of the beginnings of Christianity. The reason you haven't read a lot of him is because it's not been translated. And it's hard to get. This book in English is available at Wheaton College, Bart Ehrman's alma mater. I was thinking of driving over there. It's only like 28 miles from my house. And scanning it.
yeah, there's a lot of good books in the in this Jesus mythicist literature that I was writing about earlier. That this discussion we're having now reminds me of Walter Castle's Supernatural Religion, which is something I highly recommend everyone interested in this subject read. It's extremely detailed. It's a very thick book, and what he's done is he's done a survey of the early Christian literature, basically up to, I don't know, maybe the 3rd century, looking at from, say, Papias all the way through to possibly, I can't remember if he goes all the way up to Eusebius, but he examines, for example, Justin Martyr. He looks very, very closely at the original Greek and compares it to the New Testament and shows the differences. And this is just one element of his book. He does this with Diatessaron and with pretty much every text we've mentioned tonight, to see if there's any evidence of the existence of the canonical Gospels before the end of the 2nd century. And it's really, really well done. So that's Walter Castle's Supernatural Religion.
How do you
That's an
spell his
unfortunate
last name?
title.
Very much. Let me see. I think it's...
Oh, Castles. Okay, Cassels.
Yeah.
And it's in the public domain, so it's free.
It's
Yeah, I
an
would never
excellent
have thought
book.
it was what it's about just by the title.
I know. I said that the title should have been, where did I say that in my, that's in my Diatessaron. I said it should have been something like a critical and scientific analysis of the early Christian writings. That's really what it should have been named. I don't know why I went with that.
There was another book you named in that article, too. I can't think of what the name of that one was. By another author.
Let me see. Oh, yeah, Charles Waite's History of the Christian Religion to the Year 200, which I think is based somewhat on Hardcastle's, but they both do a pretty interesting. They do an interesting examination of Marcion as well, and Waite reconstructed what he believed was Marcion's gospel. And he did a pretty good job, I think. Yeah.
The article by Couchot that I referred to earlier, I put the link in the chat, and I also, for the benefit of people watching this on the YouTube later, I got it on my screen share.
Okay, that's you, Wayne.
Thank you, Wayne.
Classical. Yeah. Okay, so it's Herman Dietering's page.
Yes.
Of course.
I think more than anything, particularly David Parker's book, Textual Criticism and the Makings of the New Testament, Himmelong and Ehrman, I think are a really good sign of the times that textual critics need to give up on this idea of the originals, like the original copy of like when scholars keep talking about like, oh, this is what the original would have said. Like Ehrman's given up on that, Parker's giving up on that. Pretty much everybody seems to be just eventually moving away from this idea that we can get back to the originals, that even by the earliest copies that could possibly come back, like we're talking not even just like the copies of copies of copies, but like a copy of a copy, even that would have significant textual variation. So I really recommend Parker's book on that.
Yeah, there's a ontological disconnect between anything original. I mean, say that there was a Paul and he was using amnusis to take dictation, or there were several copies being made simultaneously. From what came out of his mouth to what got written down, there's going to be differences right there.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's really interesting is one of my favorite editions in the library is the early church fathers commentaries on scripture. And what's really fascinating is you're looking at some of these guys who are coexisting in the same time period, exegeting by ancient practical standards, but they're still trying to be theologians and historians but church ministers, and they're all exegeting some of the same passages, and their conclusions at times share a lot of things in common, but in other times are really different from one another. So right there, like these guys are existing not too far after the apostles or whenever they were written, or maybe close to, who knows. But even then, those guys have such variation in how those texts should be interpreted and used. So.
I would love to see all these great minds put on a hypothetical quest. If we could take the contention that the Gospels do not, well, it's actually a fact, the Gospels do not emerge in the historical record clearly until the end of the 2nd century. And I mean clearly. I mean, like, they are all of a sudden bursting onto the scene, and we have all kinds of commentary on them. But prior to that, they're like you have to go out there with a magnifying glass and try to find any kind of indication of, not necessarily the gospel story, but the canonical gospels themselves. Verbatim. There's no indication prior to that period that we have them. Paul doesn't quote from them. It's just not. They're just not there. And if we could have people looking, it throws convention on its ear and it offends so many people. But if we could have these scholars looking in the last quarter of the 2nd century, they might actually find out who wrote them, rather than the people whose names are falsely attached to them. For example, when Luke in the prologue addresses it to Theophilus, could he not be talking about Theophilus of Antioch, the bishop? It seems to fit very well. I discuss it a little bit of detail in my book, Who Was Jesus? This Lucan prologue mentioning the diegesis, the narrative. The narrative has appeared in many forms already by the time he writes. Could he not be referring to the other Gospels that didn't make it into the canon? Like the Gospel of the Hebrews and the what else? I've got several texts that I mentioned that Jerome points out as what Luke is referring to. There's quotes. There's a quote from Jerome I had to track down that was really, really indicative of what the Lucan prologue was referring to.
Wasn't that Theophilus the patron of Polycarp?
Well, there's only a couple of Theophiluses, unless you want to translate the name as meaning God lover, but let me see. I have a whole section on the gospel dates in my book, Who Was Jesus? And I quote, Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch. He's writing at the end of the 2nd century, and so he's been discounted as, no one wants to think that could be that late, that Luke could have written that late. Because, of course, they're trying to still fit this in as being not Luke, but Luke is reporting eyewitness accounts. But, he says, of course, Luke's many, when he says that the Diegesis has been attempted to be written by many people previously. We have Origen, Epiphanius, and Jerome trying to figure out or identify who that many is, and they mention the Gospels of the Egyptians and the 12 apostles. Let's see. Origen says the Church has 4 Gospels, heresy many, from which a certain one is written according to the Egyptians, another according to the 12 apostles. Even Basilides dared to write a gospel and to entitle it by his own name. And this is in the homily on Luke 1.1. So he's arguing that, let's see, Origen is addressing his homily specifically to Luke 1, which the evangelist discusses the many. It would appear that the Church Father is counting among these many the heresies of the Gospel of the Egyptians and the Gospel of the 12 Apostles. So in other words, he's implying that those 2 Gospels preceded Luke, and those are pretty distinctly 2nd century texts. And then I had to track down the statement by Jerome, which was also somewhat eye-opening. He says, in preface to his commentary on Matthew, Jerome says, the evangelist Luke declares that there were many who wrote the Gospels when he says, for as much as many, etc., which being published by various authors gave rise to several heresies. They were such as that according to the Egyptians, the Gospel of Thomas, and Matthias, and Bartholomew, that of the Apostles, and Basilides, and Apelles, and others that would be too tedious to enumerate. And the indication here is that that's what he's saying Luke is referring to. All those Gospels that came before his, including the Gospel of Thomas and the Egyptians, all 2nd century texts. So I think there's a kind of important testimonials as to the late dating of the Gospels. So, like I say, I had to track this stuff down. It was not easy. I had to find it in the original Greek, and sometimes some of this stuff is not. It's been buried because nobody wants to admit that Jerome is saying basically that Luke was written long after these 2nd century Gospels.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How sure are we that our reconstructions of Marcion's Gospel reflect the document that actually even existed in Marcion's time?
Why not?
It seems to be that they're too similar to Luke than I would expect them to be. So I'm wondering what assumptions are being made here regarding that.
A lot.
Yeah, it's true, because we have to base it on what the Church Fathers were saying was excised and how similar it was to Luke, and then they tell you what parts were removed and so on and forth. So, I mean, there's not a lot to go on there except take the Gospel of Luke and remove parts here and there and change it and tweak it. But what did you think, Daniel? You actually read this book by Bidun?
I haven't read the Bidun book, but in terms of like attempts to reconstruct Marcion's Gospels, there's a lot of assumptions. Like nothing has survived from Marcion's hand. Everything we know about him, about his writings, about his theology, only survives through the words of his enemies, as you pointed out just a moment ago. So you're quite right to assume, to point out that it's a really difficult thing to know what exactly Marcion's text had in it.
If I'm recalling correctly, did not, yeah. So Dr. Price has a whole section on Marcion's Apostolicon, and he's got the Gospel of Marcion in his Pre-Nicene New Testament.
Yeah, that's it. It's like Harnack, but it's a hypothetical reconstruction. There's a few people have had, they take what the early church fathers say about Marcion's gospel and then they try and reconstruct it.
Right.
But I think, personally, such an attempt is probably in vain. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder how the different reconstructions compare to each other, and if that would be a worthy effort to see if. They should all be pretty similar if they're just going to take Luke and remove the parts or change and tweak the parts that the church fathers had discussed. So
the problem is most of the stuff about Marcion's, most of the people who talk about Marcion's gospel can't, and exactly what it contained in its literary form, come from, I think, like the 3rd century, and they're talking against Marcionites. In terms of Marcion, the man from Sinope, as far as we know, we just don't know. We can only really reconstruct very broad strokes about what Marcion's Gospels Bible would have looked like.
Yeah, because you said earlier that the critics increasingly, I don't know how to describe what you said earlier, but you said that initially they weren't making the same charges against Marcion as they did increasingly in later decades. So that even that impression could be erroneous of what I think it's a crime against humanity that we don't have a copy of that original New Testament.
Can I interject again?
Sure.
One thing that bothers me in my mind in this discussion is, like I said, I find the reconstruction of Marcion's gospel to not make that much sense to me. It just doesn't seem like it should be in that time period that Marcion lived. But in contrast to that, I find the reconstructions of the Pauline epistles to be very plausible. So I'm wondering...
What do you mean that you don't find Marcion's reconstruction plausible? I'm a bit confused by what you mean by that.
I mean, the reconstruction of his Apostolicon I find very plausible, that the earlier and shorter versions of the Pauline epistles did exist in Marcion's time, and those are what he used. But him having a gospel that's so similar to Luke seems strange to me. But both of those are reconstructed using the same methodology. So if I trust one and don't trust the other, I might be being inconsistent.
I don't know that it's so surprising if we look at it that Luke actually used Marcion rather than the other way around. But I think we have to factor in here, I'd like to see a comparison between what could possibly have been in the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is another text that was destroyed, unfortunately, because that seems to be a really key text to understanding the canonical Gospels, if they are indeed later than the Gospel of the Hebrews.
Yeah, I'm trying to digitize the rest of the Pre-Nicene New Testament. I did the 27 canonical books already, but for the heck of it, I thought I'd do it. Let's start with the Gospel of Hebrews, and on screen is basically you've lost the genealogy, and Mark begins with what's in italics there in the Gospel of Hebrews, and then it continues on basically the same with Mark 1:18, and that's how it goes through all of it. It's according to Dr. Price's reconstruction, except for the parts that were added that we know from church fathers and quotes and things, that it was generally speaking the Gospel of Matthew with very little changes, just stuff missing. And he just took out enough to make it a certain length, which was the length was recorded by somebody in antiquity. So he cut out this and that to make it fit the length, and then put in, the things that. But I'm going through it, and it's basically I'm just sticking in Matthew and just making a few changes, and I just don't think that the Gospel of Hebrews would have been so similar, virtually identical, except for a few passages here and there. So.
I see a question about the Q reconstruction, which some have said may be also the Gospel of the Hebrews, a sayings gospel, which is also the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that Papias refers to.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
So yeah, I mean that could be a Q source.
Equivalent documents are the same thing.
Yes, but it seems like maybe there were several people rewriting them and adding this and that and changing that and this, but they're so again, getting back to a core text, may have been oral sayings that were collected by one person, oral sayings collected by another person. It's really quite messy, unfortunately. But again, though, if we can start focusing a little more on pre-Christian influences, you can see some of these things. I still think a nice study would be done with the wisdom of Jesus, Ecclesiasticus. People don't even realize that there was this book that made it into the Catholic canon of 3 Jesuses prior to the supposed historical Jesus, and that wisdom of Jesus was a father, a grandfather, a father, and a grandson who are making these, having these sayings. So we have a whole pile of sayings of Jesus that precede the Common Era, and I haven't done a study of. I don't know if there is one comparing those. I've looked at them, but we would really need to look at the original Greek and compare them side by side with any kind of mention of the sayings of the Lord, the Logia.
Are you talking about the Coptic Sophia of Jesus?
No, I'm talking about Ecclesiasticus. It's called the Wisdom of Jesus.
Wisdom of excuse me, Ben Sirach.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that it's from the 2nd century BC.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I'm surprised that that text isn't more popular, given that I forget which chapters, but one of the earlier chapters. One of the earlier chapters has a passage that reads almost like a direct description of the Christian gospel, including the resurrection of Jesus. It's just bizarre in that sense.
You see, and that would be a source text that people are not paying attention to. It's this. There's almost a fear of looking at pre-Christian material, including the apocryphal intertestamental literature. Like what is it? The 12 Apostles. What's that text? Well, there's a whole pile of them. I write about them in several of my books, but there's so many indications, for example, in these earlier texts, the intertestamental literature, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that the Jews wrote, that they describe messiahs, and this could be drawn upon. And the same thing with Philo. I mean, you read Philo, and there's just a whole description of the Logos and numerous concepts that made it into Christianity. It looks like his work was drawn upon too, and this is why I think if we start thinking of the Canonical Gospels as 2nd century compositions, it opens up all of these other possible influences on them. For example, Philo's later writings up to about 50. Well, that's when he died, so I'm assuming he had some writings up to that point. But that's a whole can of worms that I don't see a lot of people. Bob Price has been looking into it, but I don't see a lot of other people giving that kind of thought, that instead of looking at the gospel story as something that actually happened, looking at it as a construction, a compilation, a myth, and then looking at the elements. This is what I've been doing, looking at all the elements that could have been used in that composition, rather than it happened in history and so there was no influence on it.
There's something I mentioned in an earlier Hangout that I want to repeat for DM's benefit here. Regarding the long and short versions of the ending of Mark, I tend to want to read Mark as a complete allegory regarding the destruction of Jerusalem and basically the resurrection of the kingdom of God in the form of the Christian church and etc. As part of that allegory, I look at the um, abrupt ending of Mark as handing the job of telling the Jews, I guess, about the resurrection to the reader. Basically, the women are too afraid to tell, and then the gospel ends, and that looks to me like if the reader understands the allegory, the reader knows it's now the reader's job to do that telling.
I missed the first part of what you were saying about that. I'm not sure where you're going with that.
I was saying that on the abrupt ending of Mark, where the women run away because they're afraid and they tell nobody about the resurrection, as I look at Mark as being a complete allegory entirely, I think the point there is to pass on to the reader the job of telling.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, there was an awful lot of oral stuff going on. That's what's making it so difficult for us. Texts were expensive. So they could have been just reading this and then like a telephone, just telephone game. The next person who tells it adds a little more to it. But I think that's why we need to constantly look at outside the Christian effort. Look at the Egyptian mythology, for example. So much of Christianity was created in Egypt. I'm absolutely convinced, at Alexandria. The Gospel of John seems to be directed at an Egyptian audience. Some of the elements that are in the Gospel of John that are not found in the other synoptics. For example, the story of Lazarus, is that not only exclusively in John, if I recall correctly?
It's in Luke and John.
Oh, it is in Luke too.
In Luke, it is just
it's in the parable. Yeah.
But John takes that parable and reverses some of the point of it in a lot of places. In Luke's parable, Lazarus is not resurrected. He basically says even if you were to come back to life and tell your brothers, they wouldn't change. They wouldn't believe you.
Yeah.
But John turns that all around.
See, that story just reeks of the resurrection of Osiris by Horus. And so if John's provenance is in Egypt. That's where we find the earliest fragments of it. It seems to have been written for, and that just, there's many different elements like that seem to have been written for an Egyptian audience, trying to appeal to the Egyptians who had all of these wondrous spiritual concepts that they were extremely fond of and were not willing to give up easily, that you would incorporate an element like that. And I actually have side-by-side writings from the Egyptian texts that are very similar to the story of Lazarus. A lot of these things, and then if you look at the, if you assume that, and I think we can safely assume, at least in my mind, that some of the Gnostic effort, Valentinus, Basilides, preceded the emergence of the canonical Gospels. That makes them, they are increasingly historicized and Judaized. So if you look at the Gnostic efforts and they're coming out of Egypt, and also obviously the Antiochian, the Syrian efforts, which are very non-historical, non-literal, very weirdly off into in bizarro world, so to speak, and they're not anchored necessarily in history. The Jesus is kind of a phantasm. You can see the Syrian elements, Syrian Gnosticism. You can see the Egyptian elements. Really need to look at these Gnostic texts as preceding the canonical Gospels and see, even if you don't subscribe to the theory, just take a look and see if it doesn't make sense that this came first. This non-historicizing perspective came first. and was historicized. It actually fits, in my mind, it fits better that way. I guess that's what makes me a mythicist.
I think a lot of the parallel stuff is really interesting to me. Like I just finished a book that Dr. Price recommended called "What is a Gospel," and Talbert goes through talking about the concept of the theos on air, and like Hercules, epic heroes whose births were announced by angels, and cosmic portents. There's definitely a lot of pagan and foreign influence in there for sure. I think that's undeniable. I mean, the same narrative structures and themes you can find in there. It's just so close.
John, I'm having to copy your statements on Ben Sirach. Now, was that you, Doug?
Yeah, that was me just talking, yeah. And the parallels to Romulus are pretty striking, too. And those go way back. 3rd or 5th century BC.
Some of these concepts were so strongly adhered to, and very passionately. And when I think we have to keep with New Testament scholars and theologians get really high criticism. They get very nitpicky and detailed. But when you're trying to create a religion to appeal to the masses, you have to keep going back to what the masses would understand and what would appeal to them, and what would be the elements that you would use if you were trying to create such a religion. And for example, resurrection from death, everybody wants that to happen, and there's indications that this was a common belief long before the Common Era, possibly even back thousands of years. There are discussions when we find even Neanderthal graves that there's some kind of hope for an afterlife, and so that would be a really important element to include in a religion if you were trying to make it popular. And it depends on the audience, of course. Then if you have virgin birth, there's tons of evidence, and I give it in great detail from older texts, including even the Canaanite, the Ugaritic texts, where the discussion of the goddess Anat, who's the Virgin Mother of a wife of El, God the Father. She's got twins who are representative of the morning star, Venus, and that's, of course, what Jesus is stated to be in Revelation. If you look at that need for a Virgin Mother concept, these are things that would appeal to the masses, and and that's why they're incorporated into the gospel story. So you can go strip each one of these elements off. The supernatural ones are the easiest ones to start with, obviously, because we're not going to presume that those were literal and historical. And then you see that, well, that would appeal to the average worshiper, as opposed to, say, Gnosticism or the theological concepts that people discuss in more academic settings. That Gnosticism would be very difficult for the average person to wrap his or her mind around. I find it to be it's mystifying, right? It's very strange. You can understand it more readily if you look at the pre-Christian mythology in the regions where it developed, say, in Syria and Egypt. But if you look around and you see these common beliefs, another factor, of course, would be like the Greek religions of Dionysus, extremely influential. Wherever the wine spread and the vine grew would be these myths, and the resurrection, and just there's a huge mythos associated with Dionysus that was extremely influential, and that we surely can find in the New Testament, the story of the wedding of Cana, for example, with the drunken debauchery and the massive amounts. It was like 150 gallons or so. Or they're already drunk, you know.
And in the book of Acts, there's a lot of references to scenes from the Bacchae. In Acts 2, on the Pentecost scene, the flames of fire above their heads, that's taken directly from the Bacchae. He escaped from prison several times. They're all copying scenes from the Bacchae. So and there's even almost a direct quote in one point. "Why do you kick against the goads?"
The tongues of fire thing is just like, that's a little too specific to be a coincidence.
Yeah.
I mean,
do you know of, Wayne? Do you know of a study that's been done? Is that I haven't?
That's in Robert M. Price's book.
Is it? Price did that?
Which one of them? It's on the one with the white cover.
Colossal?
No, the small one with the white cover. I just forgot the name of it.
This is the white cover one.
Oh, I missed what you said.
Deconstructing Jesus is the white cover one.
No, a smaller paperback I have. A more recent book.
Isn't Deconstructing Jesus that one?
Does he have it in that one, too?
It's the only white one I can think of.
You know, I have
to get up and check my bookshelf for a second. I'll be right back.
I have Anne Rice's copy of of Price's book. Do you remember that, John, when somebody posted it on the Bible Geek?
Oh yeah, I remember that.
It's where is it? Was it Deconstructing Jesus? I went and bought it from Powell's bookstore. I had to have it because I thought it was just so funny. So you know who Anne Rice is, right?
Oh yeah.
Talking vampires, right?
Yeah. Well, she had read Price's book. Where is it?
Yeah, she converted to Catholicism, then she unconverted.
Oh, it's The Incredible Shrinking Man. So
the one I was thinking of is The Case Against the Case for Christ.
Oh yeah, that's his reply to Lee Strobel's book, right?
And he has references to similarities between the New Testament and the Bacchae in here.
See, that's why Price and I get along, because he likes to do the comparative religion that other people pretend doesn't exist. So, yeah, I have Anne Rice's copy of The Incredible Shrinking Man, Son of Man. And she says in here, I got her handwriting in it. It says, not recommended, superficial, contains errors, very sure and of its skeptical stance. I didn't learn much from here. Dump. That's so funny because it's ridiculous. But
Well,
I had to have it.
She'll have her new Lestat book out soon. She's back into the vampire game.
You know, I just noticed too that she's written a whole pile of notes in here too. So I don't know how she could say that there's nothing. Oh, here she's talking about Anat in here. Elion. These are things that the suffering servant. There's some great stuff in here. That's in a very amusing keepsake, though. Very interesting, she says later on. Who can figure out people when they cling to these beliefs? So, when I'm talking about Dionysus, I go into a lot of detail about Dionysus in my Moses book. And did Moses exist? The myth of the Israelite lawgiver. There's so many comparisons between Moses and Dionysus, it's quite shocking. And I'd like to do the same thing for a Christ in Greece book. And do the comparisons side by side of Dionysus and Jesus. I've got articles on that. Dionysus resurrected, born on December 25th of a virgin. People don't know these details though, and they love to argue against them. But they're solidly referenced in the Moses one, where I went into details comparing Moses and Dionysus. I went and dug up the Greek for all these different parallels, and well, a lot of them were written in Greek, some of them in Latin. Obviously, I did studies in Hebrew as well, but most of the material we're talking about is in Greek. And I included the references to the Greek. I think y'all would enjoy it.
Sounds interesting.
It's pretty extensive. I have a list of something like 45 or 50 parallels between Moses and Dionysus, and I think the same can be done. There's more than the dozen or so parallels between Jesus and Dionysus. There's more in the, let's see. Yeah, so the Bacchic attributes that are in common with Moses. I cite Cicero, Pausanias, Diodorus, Homer, Artapanus, Apollodorus, Philostratus, Euripides, Macrobius, Callimachus, Seneca, Nonnus, of course, Strabo. So it's pretty extensive material. It's not, and it's all been an Ovid, it's Cicero. It's all been suppressed. And this is stuff that you'll find in the older Jesus mythicist literature. And that should not be discounted because these older scholars actually knew the ancient texts very, very well, much better than most people today. It was de rigueur to learn Greek and Latin back then. That's one of the reasons why I did it, studying the classics. So we're dismissing this older literature. You're missing out on a lot, including that they knew these ancient texts in their original languages so well that they often didn't need to cite them with each other. They could have a discussion like we're having now and speaking in Greek and Latin, and the individuals in the conversation would know exactly what text it was coming from. So like talking well above the masses, so to speak, in this regard. And I think that you would, if you dug into this literature, you'd enjoy it very much. It's right up your alley if you like reading Greek and Latin and more intellectual or ancient texts.
Unfortunately, I can't read either of those languages.
Oh, well, I include translations as well, and in fact, if you read the Moses book, for example, there's, even in the Hebrew, you probably be able to learn quite a bit of it. When I do translation, I do them so literally that you can kind of see the words as you're going along and learn.
I've dabbled with enough Greek that if I open the Septuagint to a random page, or a random verse, I can find 2 or 3 words I recognize, but not enough that I can actually figure out what it actually says.
Well, then you got to use the blueletterbible.org, because that really can help learn more about that. In fact, then you move on to what I did with, what I like to do often is to take a word and do a word search in texts on Perseus.edu and find mentions of the word in the Greek classical texts from the New Testament, for example. One of these pursuits involved the Greek word for the resurrection, or anastasis, in the New Testament, and it's exact same word used to describe the resurrection of the Egyptian god Horus by Diodorus in the 1st century BCE. So we have a resurrection of the Egyptian god Horus using the Greek word anastasis, and then this term makes it into the New Testament. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that. It's really, really interesting.
DM, you're referring to the study guide for Did Moses Exist? That section called Writers on the Dionysus Connection?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, that I was referring to earlier with the Dionysus connection. Yeah, that there's a whole slew of people from the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century who are making these comments about Moses and Dionysus having such similar biographies. And there was such massive amount of material that I had to make a separate study guide to include and a lot of it have the original Greek that they're referring to. So the same thing can be done with the study between the elements of Dionysian myth and Christianity, of course. If I ever live that long. Go ahead.
I got the Song of the Sea in that book so far, in the study guide.
Yeah. I'm glad you're reading that, though.
Little by little.
Daniel's left. Okay, bye, Daniel. I guess we need to
Take care, Daniel.
wind it down. It was nice having him here.
Usually these go on when we're off the air for sometimes hours. I think last
Are we
time
off the air now?
No, we're still live.
This is all going to be in video.
Like 1 a.m. I think last time I was.
Oh, really? Well, I can see why. This is kind of arcane stuff that you don't get to discuss very often. I certainly can't do it really well on Facebook. There's too many people waiting to, jump on me, attack me.
Well, that's why we like doing it here, so we can all have a place, people that are basically have a like-minded approach, and we can all discuss it here.
Yeah, that's nice. I'm pleasantly surprised. Thanks for indulging my ramblings.
Well, Tim Whittlefield told me last night in a chat, or not last night, last week in a chat, he said he enjoyed the Hangout because he has nobody to talk to about these things.
That's true. I used to have someone around who could speak in the minutia, and we had some very strange conversations that no one else could understand. And we would make jokes about, Justin Martyr said blah 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 blah. We talk about nerds. So anyway, that's cool. I'm glad to share with you guys here.
Trying to find that exact tongues of fire thing from the Bacchae.
In Price's book?
Well, I'm just trying to find it directly, the actual lines from the Bacchae where it talks about that.
Well, I see Daniel didn't like my inventing a religion comment, but I have to point out that just a couple centuries before Christianity was created, the priesthood of Egypt created Serapis, and that the Greek god Zeus and all the other ones were also created, and their religions were invented. And so this idea that Christianity among all these other ones is historical, whereas they are mythical, is rather a conceit. And so I would have to disagree with that. If the Greek religion is invented to appeal to the masses based on observations of nature and life in the Greek world, there's no reason to suggest that Christianity was not invented in a similar manner. And Serapis, in fact, being a combination, this syncretized god Osiris and Apis, which Osiris and Apis were already syncretized, but this god was specifically created to appeal to the Egyptians and the Greeks, and I think also the Jews, in order to unify them under a single religious worship, form of religious worship. There's little reason to suggest that Christianity was not created for the same purpose. In fact, it seems to me that the Serapis cult was sort of a misfire or a practice run that didn't quite work out, and they regrouped and created a new religion again that turned out to be Christianity. Many of the elements of Serapis made their way into the Christ myth as well.
Oh, I don't want to interrupt, but Doug, the lines from the Bacchae are supposed to be lines 757 through 758, according to Dr. Price's The Christ in the Theory book. flames flickered in their curls and did not burn them.
And also 623 and 624.
Thank you.
Okay.
Why can't I find this anywhere? Okay, 757.
You have the expurgated version.
So. I found the kicking against the goats thing.
Okay, I'm gonna have to say goodbye now. But it's been a delight, guys, and I may come back again.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. We appreciate you dropping by. You're welcome anytime.
Alrighty then.
I was here for my talk on Genesis 1, but okay.
Your talk on Genesis 1?
Yeah, I just had some observations. I didn't have a thesis or a particular question. I just had some observations I wanted comments on.
I see. Okay, well, is that next, or you already did that?
We haven't done it yet.
Ah, all right. Well, send me an invite, and I may be able to make it.
No, we're sticking to doing it here now. I mean, later in this chat.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got to attend to some stuff now, though. But I appreciate you guys indulging me, so hopefully I'll be back again. Take care.
Thanks. We hope to see you back.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good evening.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, Wayne, if you wanted to wait for another time, that's fine.
It's up to you guys. And that really annoying echo is back.
It's like it's worse.
I'm good either way. Whatever you want to do, Wayne. It's up to you.
I think I'll just do it now, if you guys are done with the previous discussion.
Yeah, because I feel like I'd like to discuss your topic and then call it quits for myself, personally.
Yeah.
I can save the ending of Mark thing for another time.
So give me a second here.
I'm happy that other people are...
I'm just forgetting what my
taking
keyboard
the lead.
shortcuts are for this program. So on my screen share, I have a color-coded table regarding where certain features occur in the Genesis creation account. And the features themselves are mentioning of the day number, which occurs in 7 instances, of course. Mentioning of morning and evening, which occurs only in 6, because it doesn't occur for the Sabbath day, which is kind of logical, because it happens after the morning and evening starts the Sabbath. So, God said, "Let there be," occurs several times. A statement that what He said, "Let there be," came to be and actually was so occurs 7 times. A statement that God saw that and saw that it was good occurs 7 times, but not exactly corresponding to when it says it was so. There's 2 places they don't match up. There's also places where God directly acts, and it's actually kind of strange if you read it a certain way, and because there's places where God says, "Let something be," and then the text says, "And it was so," and then the text, very next thing it says is that God acts in some way to make it be. So it's like the God making it be and the "and it was so" verse are like in the wrong sequence or something. Plus, there's also 3 instances of God giving blessings, and only 3 instances of God naming what He's created. But that's kind of explainable by some of the latter things He created being too complicated or too many to name. Like he doesn't name all the individual animals. The second creation account later in Genesis does have Adam naming the animals, but that's from a separate source, so I wouldn't comment on this passage based on what's there.
Now, are you taking into account, Wayne, the fact that like things like the Septuagint has things in different places and has things that apparently have dropped out of the Hebrew.
Yes. I didn't do a thorough check, but I did do a cursory glance at both the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, and they seem to completely agree with the Masoretic text regarding Genesis 1. I saw no significant differences worth mentioning. If you see a difference there that I missed, I'd love to hear about it.
I'm looking at the Catholic New American Bible because they changed the, they're working with the Hebrew text, but they're changing it whenever they feel like it to match the Septuagint. And one of those things I think is Genesis 1:9, where the Hebrew text is, then God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into a single basin so that the dry land may appear. And so it happened. Now this whole section, the waters under the sky was gathered into the basin and the dry land appeared. I believe that they say that that is misplaced from another verse somewhere. See if there's a footnote or something. Through haplography, meaning that they, their eyes skipped and put it in a different place than where they were looking at it in the manuscripts they were copying.
That would be interesting. I'll have to take another look at that and see if I overlooked that. I have the actual text of Genesis from the New Revised Standard Version color-coded here on these slides to show the different features that I was putting on the other table, on the other chart. This is an interesting case here. The slide I have up now shows the events of the third day. And God said, let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw it was good. Now that looks like a unit, like the other units here, but there's no day given to that. It's the next part is just combined with it as part of the same day. Then God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on the earth that bear fruit with a seed in it. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with a seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. This really looks like two different repetitions of the kind of creation unit that the storyteller is using, except for one of the units is not separated out into its own day, but it's just two of them are combined into the same day. And I find that to be an interesting phenomenon. It also happens on day 6.
You're saying that there's a parallel between day, 3 and 6?
Both of those have two different repetitions of this pattern occurring.
So I've seen many sites that go into some of the structure of Genesis, basically aligning the first 3 days alongside the second 3 days. So 1 with 3, 2 with 4, and 3 with 6. A lot of the same. There's parallel events happening on those days consistently. If I could think of where I saw that.
Yeah, on day 4 is one of the instances where I think the "and it was so" seems to be misplaced. It starts with, and God said, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. And it was so. But then the text immediately goes on, God made the 2 lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and morning the 4th day. But it just seems like if the "and it was so" meant that the act of creation was completed at that point, why is there needing to have a direct action of God after that point?
Yeah, it seems like Seems like there's an expansion on the stuff in yellow.
Yeah, I was thinking earlier, in fact, I even looked at, I don't have it here as slides, but just taking the yellow and the "and it was so" and the "and God saw it was good," you just stream all those together with nothing else, and it's a coherent account. It doesn't read you like there's anything missing. Start at day one and keep going through and just read those parts of it, and it reads like it's its own independent text. But it could just be a poetic repetition. I mean, look, just kind of a doublet, where God says, "Let there be," and then God making a direct action later doing it is just kind of, in a poetic sense, just describing the same thing two different ways.
I think that's like the usual interpretation, although it's intriguing that you're pointing that out, because it seems like, yes, it's very possible that you're looking at, what are you saying, like there's two interweave sources there, in a way?
Supposedly, according to the documentary hypothesis, this is all the P source, nothing intermixed. But it looks to me like something might be intermixed. I don't know really what to make of it, but that's what it looks like to me.
Yeah, were you there on that discussion we had with Dr. Price about Genesis 6, I think, during the flood story, where even though it was talking about the birds being released and that's supposed to all be, what was it, J source or something, it still sounded like there might have been more than one source there, even, subdivided. So,
and supposedly with the P source, the flood account occurs immediately after this creation account. So there's a direct connection between them.
Yeah, reading the individual sources is very revealing. If you read like the Yahweh source alone, it goes straight from Adam all the way to Lamech, who's the father of Noah, and it completely eliminates the P genealogies. So it it almost appears as if the prophecies in the Garden of Eden, where God said that the land's going to be a curse, then directly later on Noah's born, and the first thing you say, he's going to be a relief from the curse. So it's like no messianic prophecy there. That was a prophecy of Noah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Rather than Jesus, or as the Catholic Church took it early on, was that it was a prophecy of Mary somehow. Because I never noticed that when I was in church, I would always see these statues of Mary, and she's standing on a snake. And it never occurred to me why that was. I never asked anybody or anything. But that was the original interpretation of what God said to the serpent, that the Vulgate translated as feminine. So that was a feminine seed will stomp on the snake's head, meaning Mary, not Jesus. Interesting.
Anyway, I'd like to go through each of the units in this creation account and just see what observations we have on them as individual units. We start out with Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2, which just gives a simple introduction. And I tried looking at it to see if something seemed to be interpolated there, but it's just too hard to tell, and especially from the English. I'd have to do this kind of analysis directly on the Hebrew, but I don't know Hebrew. And the other thing I want to look for here, just make an aside, something else to keep in mind, there may be doublets here intentionally, like the Sumerian Babylonian creation account, the Enuma Elish, is a poetic account, but it's not like rhyming poetry or anything. It doesn't even have meter, but it's poetic in the sense that all the verses are in pairs, whereas one verse says something one way, and the next verse says it a kind of a different way, or says something that's kind of contrasting to it but keeps the same theme. And each, as you go through it, it's all that way. Pair, another pair, another pair, another pair. There's some things in Genesis that seem to be paired that way, but I'm not sure, though. I need to check in actual Hebrew. There's places where it seems to be using triplets instead of doublets. And there's places where it might even have a chiastic structure, where it's like an A, B, B, A thing, where It mentions something on one theme, then something on a second theme, then repeats something on that second theme, and then goes back to the first theme again.
Oh, I found what I was talking about earlier. On my screen I have what they're talking about, the patterns of Genesis 1. It says the 6 days of creation are divided into 2 matched panels of 3 days each, as shown in the chart here. During the first 3 days of creation, we see God building I guess that's continuing. Anyway, there's the chart there.
I don't see
Prologue,
it shared.
introductory. Oh, maybe I died. You have to click on me because you're the one sharing the screen, I think.
I have been clicking on you.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Do I have to stop my screen share first?
No, but I think you have to click on your avatar to bring it down.
Yeah, I clicked on your avatar directly. Now it comes up.
Okay. Anyway, this interpretation of dividing the 6 days into matching sets, they call it 3 days of separation versus 3 days of integration. So, just that something I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah. But
That's
anyway,
from the Catholic Study Bible. But
That's interesting. I never noticed that at all.
there's some other sites I read too. We were talking about the mechanical translation of Genesis, I believe, or I put a link to it in the last chat. But that guy has an extensive website on all things Old Testament, and some of it's kind of way out, a little fringe. There are some interesting essays and things on there. So, if I can think of the link, I'll throw it in the chat.
I want to continue going through my slides since I took the time to make them.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So anyway, on the first unit is God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light was good. And that so far reads as a complete thing. Everything else later in the unit seems to just supplement that, but not really add anything that new to the story. And God separated the light from the darkness. And the question is, what does that actually mean? It could be that God saw the light was good, so that is why he separated it out from the darkness, but that's how he made there be separate light. It's like it could be a separate account there of the creation of light. If that makes any sense. It's intermingled with the darkness in the chaos, and then he creates it by separating it out. Seems to be a different thing in my mind than just saying, "Let there be light," and having light appear.
Well, also too, like John was saying, it follows that separation theme.
Yeah.
And in the next one it says, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And there's again separation happening.
And notice on the second unit, the "and it was so" is moved to later.
Yeah, after the... Okay, so up here, it's God actually speaking.
And there was light.
Yeah.
So at that point, why does it need to be separated from the darkness still?
One of the things I read earlier was the scholarly opinion is that the Hebrews didn't consider darkness as the absence of light, but an actual palatable thing. So that when darkness would roll over you or come into it wasn't because the light was going out, it's because darkness was itself coming in. So you could have a separation between two physical things, a light thing and a darkness thing.
Mm-hmm. It just seems strange to me that I'm entertaining lots of contradictory thoughts here and diverse thoughts here, so I haven't really filtered out in my mind yet.
Wrong!
What was that?
Now, all of Genesis 1, or most of Genesis 1, is a single source, right? It's J, I think?
P, the priestly source.
Oh, it is P, okay. Yeah.
Also, on the first, the first and second day, God names what he has. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the second day, God called the dome sky or heaven.
So he's naming it.
Which is a standard thing to do in creation accounts.
Yeah.
But that does not continue throughout the Genesis passage. He goes on so far that it just stops doing it. Going to the next slide, and God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So there's another naming there.
Yeah.
So that's actually the last occurrence of naming in this in the whole passage.
And after that, it seems that things are coming about of themselves. You know.
Well, just in the very next part, then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation. It doesn't say that God created vegetation. It says the earth brought it forth.
Right.
Yeah. But he did speak, "Let the earth bring forth,"
yeah.
And then it happened.
Well, the earth brings it forth after it says, "And it was so," but that could just be a poetic doublet. But this is the only place here where things happen passively, where the earth itself has creative power. Everything else in here, God himself has the creative power. But here, the earth has the creative power. And then the next unit, and God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there's evening and morning the fourth day. I actually have a question on the Hebrew in here, where it says the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. And then the New Revised Standard Version kind of puts a long dash there, "and the stars." Other translations say, "and God made the stars too." But I'm wondering if that's really the correct reading of the Hebrew, whether it's actually saying that the lesser light is ruling the stars, whether that's actually a direct object from the previous clause.
Yeah, I don't know. I wish I knew Hebrew.
Does that question make sense to you?
Yeah, it does, but I mean, yeah, you'd have to get someone that knows the Hebrew well enough.
There's also, I don't have it marked in my table, but several instances of dominion on here. And here, you know, the stars are said to rule. Later on, God gives man dominion over the animals and things. So that could be another repeated theme I could have mentioned on the table, but did not.
What translation is that, Ruben? Okay. There be luminaries in the expanse of the heavens to separate between the day and between the night, and they shall be for signs and for appointed seasons and for days and years.
So the translation Reuben gave says to rule the night and the stars, which kind of agrees with how I was looking at it. But there's a comma there, so I don't know if that's what the translator intended or not. On the fifth day, and God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." Now, if we compare this back to the earlier time where God said, let the earth bring forth, and we said it was passive, that the earth itself had creative power, here that theme is not kept. It's God himself does the creating still here. So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, of every kind, which the waters swarm, and every bird of every kind. So there's a direct action by God here. And God saw that it was good.
I wonder if they assumed that plants and vegetation were literally part of the earth rather than being, in the domain of life. Because I've heard people argue too that way back then they may not have considered plants to actually be living.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Be alive like animals are. So they may have thought that, that's just part of the earth. That's just what the earth does. Whereas in this case, but then again, it would be weird. Why would he phrase it, let the waters bring forth swarms? It should be like, and God said, let there be swarms in the oceans or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's kind of a mixing up there.
And why the passage no longer has God naming things, at this point it starts with God blessing things. And in some sense, those might be similar themes.
And these are the things, if you notice, these are the things, because God stopped naming things. He didn't name anything on the last one either, right?
Yeah.
With the vegetation. So maybe these are all the things that Adam is going to name.
Well, that's a separate source, though, according to the documentary hypothesis, so I don't really know.
Oh, yeah, so we wouldn't have had that in mind.
To try tying those together.
I'm harmonizing.
Yeah. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And then we have another unit, and it's another pair of units on the same day. And in this case, they wouldn't both fit on the same slide, so I have them on separate slides. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind. So that same kind of let the earth bring forth. And then it says, and it was so. But then it goes on to say, God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. One speculation I might make is that this direct action by God's been inserted into the story because thinking that the earth itself would have this much power of creation may have became considered heretical at a later age. So maybe earlier the story only has the God said, let it bring forth, and it was so. But later on, the God made was added to it to make it reflect more on the power of God.
Well, a lot of this can be seen as polemic against other accounts of creation, polytheistic accounts.
Do you think so?
Oh yeah, I think it's deliberate. Some of it is obviously deliberate. For instance, not naming the sun and the moon, calling them luminaries. To give them names is what the polytheists did.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. That the names there, that's when he stops the naming, because they probably don't want the names of pagan deities inside this passage.
Yeah, and we're also looking at like a hierarchy where we're moving up the ladder of being. Mm-hmm. So you're starting out with bugs and germs, but now he's blessing higher forms of animals and so forth.
Of course, he doesn't bless here. You notice.
Yeah, that's one thing missing from this part is there's no naming or blessing.
Yeah.
Going on to the next half of the sixth day, because there's no and morning and evening as in this unit. That's not part of this unit. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. And then there's a blessing here, which is a pretty long blessing. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And then there's evening and morning the sixth day. One thing I find strange here is that the "and it was so" comes after the blessing. You'd think that would actually happen before the blessing, that these things come into existence.
What's interesting too with the naming convention, if you look at the Enuma Elish, it starts out, it says, "When in the height heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name."
Yes.
Whereas here we have things being named.
Yeah, I don't think there's all that many similarities between this creation account and the Enuma Elish, but the similarities that are there are quite spectacular.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with the waters is pretty big.
The Enuma Elish came on 7 tablets, and I think that's part of the inspiration for trying to pack this into 7 days. And the 7th tablet is simply an account of the gods resting. They basically create mankind as their slave to do up the menial labor so the gods can rest.
Which is essentially Genesis, because Adam is the gardener of the garden, and he doesn't really, he's not asked if he wants to be, he just is.
Yeah, he doesn't even bother creating a mate for him.
And then there's mention of the separation of waters, both in Genesis here and in the Enuma Elish. So I didn't actually find many more similarities beyond that. The Enuma Elish basically tells of Marduk basically becoming the chief of the gods, as as part of his deal he makes with the other gods, in order to have him defeat Tiamat. And none of that is here, and nothing like it is here.
Well, some people speculate that Tehom comes from Tiamat.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at a disguised or a sublimated.
Aren't there parallels with Leviathan too?
Yeah, in Job and other places.
There's a mention here of the let me go back a couple slides.
Yeah, the sea monster.
So God created the great sea monsters and every living thing that moves. But yeah, what I find interesting here is that some of the units of repetition here are inconsistent, and there's every single rule we have here is broken at least once. And I also find it interesting that the order of elements is often odd, I guess is the best way to put it. It's hard to make sense of the sequence that the elements are in.
The first thing I'm getting by looking at all this, and the color coding is great, is that the author had certain elements that he wanted present in each of these sections, but it doesn't seem like he was super concerned necessarily about having them all present in the same order every time. But like, "and it was so" is there a lot, and God saw that it was good, that's there a lot, and God speaking and then actually doing the action, that's there a lot.
Yeah.
So he obviously had some pattern to all these different sections, but it didn't seem like he was too concerned about, deviating a little bit wherever he felt it was necessary.
That's possible, but some of these deviations just still seem bizarre.
Well, when I'm looking at what you're presenting, Wayne, So my impression is that is similar to Doug's. It just seems that there's varying stylistic differences, but it doesn't seem to be particularly significant because there's no pattern really to the deviations.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of this as a whole. I don't think I have enough evidence here that there actually is, two texts intermingled or interpolations. It's just intriguing things that may point that way but aren't conclusive.
Yeah, the documentary hypothesis is going to say, okay, this is all P, but they're not saying, how P came about. I would be, de facto just assuming that there's multiple sources that are being interwoven into a literary whole at some point. And, what you're doing could be a good way to unraveling how they're interlinked.
Possibly,
yeah. So I think it's what you're doing. It has value.
I got one more unit left, and that's for the Sabbath day. And one thing that strikes me here is that there seems to be a conclusion to the entire account at the very beginning of this unit. Thus, the heavens and the earth were finished in all their multitude. It sounds like if we going back to earlier slides, we only had the yellow and the and it was so, and God saw it was good, and strung them all together. That makes a coherent account, and then thus the heavens and the earth were finished in all their multitude, seems to be just the ending of that. But anyway, there is still a couple elements of the pattern repeated on the seventh day. There's a mention of it being the seventh day. There's a method of God taking a direct action, even if that action is doing nothing. And there's a blessing here. He's blessing the day itself. One thing that's not mentioned here is morning and evening. But it's probably, given the pattern of the timing, is no longer needed. I mean, counting off to the seventh day, you don't need to have morning and evening counted off to the eighth day. So it makes sense to me that that's missing. So now I want to go back to my summary table, now that we've gone through the passages individually, and see how the whole thing fits together. And just see if you guys have any further comments.
Yeah, so morning and evening, God let there be, God said let there be, and it was so. That seems to be a pretty consistent theme.
But sometimes there's multiple of those within a day unit. Like dry land and plants are both on day 3. Land animals and mankind are both on day 6.
Ah, okay.
It's almost like there's 8 stages of creation there packed into 6 days. And it's not just that repeated. I mean, the and it was so is repeated, twice for the third day and the 6th day. The God saw that it was good is also repeated twice on the 3rd day and twice on the 6th day.
Maybe you should have it divided into 8 columns rather than 7.
Well, I do. If you look at the rows on my chart, I have like 9 rows on this chart.
Yeah, because 3 and 6 are divided.
Okay, yeah. Maybe you can also divide them.
Oh, I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, I did divide them. I mean, if you go back to my...
You said there's 8... What did you say there was 8 what?
Well, there's 8 stages. There's light, there's the firmament, there's the dry land, there's the plants, there's the creation of the sun, moon, and stars, there's the creation of sea and air creatures, there's the creation of land animals, and then the creation of mankind.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, I get it.
It's not just that there's 8 things created there, though. It's that the pattern kind of repeats 8 times. The pattern of let there be, followed by and it was so, followed by God saw that it was good.
Oh, so in the case, say, of the dry land, there will be a separate
I'll go back to that slide.
let there be and a separate and it was so.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that is interesting.
Here, here's the 3rd day right here to show that again.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Seems like he would have just packed it all packed both the let the waters, blah blah blah, and let the earth, that maybe could have packed that into one unit.
Yeah, but they're obviously
But they're separate,
stylistically there's two units there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously there's two separate units.
And that happens twice. It happens on day 3 and again on day 6, as I said earlier.
6, yeah.
Well, is there any way to read these accounts to where you can just read one certain set and it'd be coherent, and read another set and it would be coherent as if they were two separate accounts?
The second part, I do not really think so, but maybe I need to look at it more. But the basic, God said, "Let there be," and it was so, and God saw that it was good, that definitely fits into a coherent account on its own. Whether the additional stuff with God taking directed action and Him naming and blessing things fits also, I do not know.
I wonder if originally these 8 stages were there, but then later on they wanted to put it into a 7-day cycle.
That's kind of what I'm proposing, but I don't really have enough evidence to make it a formal proposal at all. But
Yeah.
that's kind of what I'm seeing. But it's also weird, though, that the total number of "and it was so" is 7, and the total number of "God saw it was good" is also 7, but they're not the same 7, because there's no "good" for the 2nd day, and there's no "it was so" for the 5th day.
Yeah, it's hard to say because, a lot of this stuff could have fallen out accidentally, in the transmission process. That would be hard to tell.
Yeah. And go ahead, Doug.
I was just going to say, I really like that you've color-coded everything. It's a really good way to look in depth at the structural elements of the whole creation account. I really like that.
Yeah, I put it together to help demonstrate my point here clearly as possible, but also as a way to suggest what we could do with other passages in later Hangouts. I kind of wanted to up the bar on our visual presentation for the videos that go on YouTube.
I think you might be just upping the bar for yourself.
Well,
because I don't know if I can do audio-visual every time.
I just put these together using LibreOffice Write, and I'm just using, and then I made PDFs out of them because the PDFs display better for me. But
yeah, even in modern literature, you often see things where one body of literature is rewritten and pressed into a different service, to serve a whatever kind of purpose an author might have, political, what have you. Yeah. So, if you're looking at, say, like an original source that wouldn't fit in a Seventh-day creation, but it was hammered into fit, that could be a clear good demonstration of such a phenomenon.
I had done some underlining earlier to show where I thought doublets would be in this text and where the chiastic structure would be, but I took the underlines out because they just make the text too complicated on the screen to show. But now I can't remember what I was thinking earlier, how I saw that.
Now, on my screen when I was doing the source critical English translation of the Septuagint, wherever there's a difference between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, I marked them in different colors so that purple is all P, but here in the second part of verse 6 you have, and it happened in this way, which would be equivalent to, and it was so. And it might be a transposition from a different place. That's theoretical. Here in 8b, Septuagint adds, and it was good. That's just added right there. It's not in the Masoretic text. This whole section of 9b is possibly from another section that was added to that section in the Septuagint. Septuagint adds according to likeness, and here, according to kind, it adds here. So this is another good way of looking at the differences between the Septuagint, which might be based on an older version of the Hebrew text, possibly, theoretically. But it's easy to see it because, you know, you can just see the different color codings as you're going through it. So there's quite a few things the Septuagint adds that the Masoretic text does not. For instance, here in 14b. So it's just something to think about.
I have to look at that again. I was comparing just against the English of both the Septuagint and the Genesis and the Masoretic accounts, just English translations.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make a note of this stuff, so it becomes really clear to see what the differences are, and then let the scholars figure out why it's different, because I can't. But, you know, this would affect your table because, you know, for instance, and it was so occurs here, but maybe, you know, in your table it isn't occurring, so maybe it did originally and fell out.
You want to check those really quick? If I put my table back up?
Sure, if you want. All right. So according to Septuagint, in verse 6, they added, and it was so.
And I have that is in verse 7 in the text
Right.
I have.
Yeah, so they might have transposed it. It's not necessarily that it was in both places or neither. It could have just been transposed. At least it's that I have. So let's say that, okay, for the sake of argument, that it occurred there. I mean, how does that affect your table, right? Just with that one change.
Let me go back to my text. If it happens between God making the dome and him calling the dome sky, then there's no difference. But it doesn't. I see what you're saying. It's happening before him making the dome there. And in Masoretic text, it happens after he made the dome.
Yeah, exactly.
That actually supports my hypothesis, yeah, that things were changed here, that the and it was so has been long after the let there be's in every case, even though they've been moved.
Yeah, it does. Very good.
Go back to my table up again. And is there another difference with the Septuagint? Oh, and God saw it was good after the dome is missing from the Masoretic text entirely. And it is in the Septuagint. I need to note that.
Yeah, and the Septuagint was based off of earlier Hebrew, right?
Yeah, that cleans up this pattern. That makes it fit the pattern better. So whether the Septuagint added it in order to fit the pattern, or whether the Masoretic lacks it just because of corruption in the text, we don't know.
Exactly.
I would think the latter.
You know, that's hard to say because, you know, what were the Masoretic texts constructed out of? You know, they were gathering manuscripts from all over the place that were surviving and doing a little bit of text criticism, I imagine, to put together the first century. So I don't know, maybe some of their texts did have it and they just rejected it.
So now I want to check whether the Septuagint has saying, and it was so for day 5.
No, all that is the same.
Well,
Oh,
you
wait.
have.
Oh, yeah, in verse 20. And it was so.
Yeah,
After
that's
the...
exactly where it should be. Yeah.
yeah. Fascinating.
So that the Septuagint version makes this pattern even more explicit of 8 units of action.
Wow.
I really thought I checked the Septuagint, but I did such a cursory check and I didn't see the differences. And now you're showing me 3 differences already, and it's like, wow, okay, how did I miss those?
Yeah, especially since they support your thesis.
Yeah.
Now, what were the Masoretic texts based off of? Just a...
I believe it was that they had gathered together texts that they could lay their hands on after destruction of Jerusalem. So it was probably from a lot of different areas.
So had copies of the Septuagint, they weren't available at that time, or what?
No, I would imagine they were probably widely available. Although I think by then they were already in the process of rejecting it.
Just makes me wonder why they would bother with Masoretic. I mean, that was a separate that was a different translation of the Hebrew, right?
Yeah, and at one time it was widely used in the diaspora and very highly regarded among diaspora Jews.
Yeah, the Septuagint's really interesting, especially regarding Jeremiah. It has the chapters in like a really mixed up order, or a different order than people are used to seeing them, I guess, even though the order actually seems more logical. And the older view seemed to have been that the Septuagint rearranged those chapters to make them more logical. But then among the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Yeah,
happened upon a new Hebrew copy of Jeremiah, not previously known, that actually has the chapters in Septuagint order.
Now, is Jeremiah the book that's way shorter in the Dead Sea Scrolls version?
That I don't remember.
There's one J book. Starts with a J. That's... I always forget it. I always think it's Jeremiah, and I don't remember if that's right.
It might be right. So anyway, I think I'm done with what I was presenting here. Just listening for further comments, and what can we actually make of this? And
so, sorry, what you're presenting, John, this is the source labeling of the Septuagint, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I originally did this in order to show the how the documentary hypothesis would look if it was applied to the Septuagint, because I expected there to be some interesting differences and some really weird stuff going on.
Because was it really originally developed using Masoretic text, or just looking at our earliest copy of the Hebrew that Fellhausen had access to? What would that have been?
Well, if you look at the Greek, it matches up pretty much with the Masoretic text, except for a few differences here and there. It's not really that much significance. As you go along, there's a lot. It mainly looks like they were just expanding on things or clarifying or adding a few things here and there.
Okay.
Like for instance in Genesis 3:1, the Septuagint just merely adds the serpent as if to clarify who the heck is talking to the woman, as if you didn't know already. Is that significant? Was that because there was a Hebrew, the serpent there? I don't know. To me, it seems stylistic more than reflecting an underlying difference.
Now, do we know anything about which? I mean, I've heard people argue that the Septuagint should be considered more "quote-unquote" original. I mean, this is assuming before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, but I mean, do we have, in other words, are there opinions on which texts are probably more accurate to the most original form of the Hebrew? What would it have been? Like there, it said Septuagint adds. Well, how do we know that Masoretic didn't take that out?
That's because that was a choice I made to take it as if the Hebrew had priority.
Okay.
The Masoretic text removes, but on what basis could I say that?
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
John, if you're saying that later on in Genesis, the Septuagint adds a lot to the Masoretic text, things that just seem to clarify the text, that argues against my thesis on Genesis 1. That seems to think that the Septuagint is just cleaning up this parallelism, that even if it wasn't in the original sources.
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty fair assessment. That's kind of like the conclusion I was coming to.
See, I always heard that scholars thought that the Hebrew underlying the Septuagint would have been more original.
I've heard
Well,
that
because it was
also.
supposedly based on an earlier Hebrew text than what the Masoretic text was produced from.
Right.
So they would say, okay, because it's so much earlier, it's 300 BC or something like that,
Yeah.
then that would be closer to the authentic Old Testament than something that was collected 1,000 years later, or excuse me, not 1,000 years, 300 years later. But what I'm finding is that there's not a whole lot of difference except for expansions and clarifications. So really, to me, the basic underlying Hebrew is probably more or less the same. There wasn't really a whole lot of significant differences. Like here's a significant difference though in Genesis 7, where this is all Yahwist, and it's talking about of the winged things of the heavens. The Septuagint adds clean here, and then it adds a whole other thing, and of the winged things not clean 2 by 2. So it's trying to harmonize even more so the two sources. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, because it's adding in the post-Mosaic laws.
So to me it's not because that the Hebrew is lacking that or something, but I think there's a deliberate reason for making that addition, I guess.
So you're saying the Masoretic text would not have had that stuff in black, is that right? Or is that just a source difference?
Oh, let me see what the footnote says. Yeah, I'm saying that I'm saying the Hebrew text that was used by Septuagint probably didn't have that, but that was added because they wanted to harmonize the 7 clean animals and the not clean 2 by 2. But there was a reason they did that.
Now it makes me wonder because, I mean, wasn't there already that sort of thing happening in the real early form of the Hebrew based off of J and P? Because I mean, we have Noah bringing on animals 2 by 2, and then Noah's bringing on animals 2 by 2, and 7 of all the clean ones. 7 of all the clean ones, does that come from E, or does that come from the Septuagint?
Well, the 7 probably comes from what the
I'm
E
sorry,
source.
P. Yeah, not E.
P source, yeah, I'm sorry. Not E. E doesn't supposedly start till chapter 15 or something. But yes, but they're, but looking at the Masoretic text, it looks like they're interweaving. You could see it like, okay, sometimes it's using one source, sometimes it's using another source. But in the Septuagint, you see things that seem to be interpolated away from what, instead of just putting them side by side and trying to weave them together, they're actually making changes that tend to create more harmony between the two sources. To me, that's a deliberate feature of the translation into Greek rather than reflecting an actual Hebrew text. That's just my opinion.
Quick question, John. Is there anything actually Greek-like about the interpolations? I mean, maybe the Septuagint is working from a Hebrew copy, or in the Hebrew somebody cleaned up the Hebrew by adding all these additional things.
Well, that's possible. There's one theory that especially the Pentateuch has the feature of looking as if it was translated from an interlinear, where you have a Hebrew and Greek glosses, and then people were putting it together more grammatically, because you might have an infinitive form of a verb, but when they're looking at the Hebrew and translating the Greek, they're trying to replicate the grammatical structure of it so that you can't use, say, like an infinitive in a sentence to have it make sense. You have to give it a different verb tense or whatever. So it has that kind of stilted word-for-word literal quality to it when it does match the Hebrew very well. So to me, they were working from a Hebrew text, possibly using an interlinear with glosses already put in. So it's possible that they could have had additional glosses put in the Greek part, or they could have made changes to the Hebrew to reflect and then translate it. It's hard to say. I really can't tell from looking at it myself. There's one other thing I wanted to...
So it looks like the Septuagint may be doing more of what P did already. Would that be in regards to emphasizing the clean animals? Because that's the P stuff, right? Like I'm talking about in the Noah's flood, the whole narrative.
Yeah, the P source has the unclean, the 7
Yeah,
pairs.
so, and you're saying that the Septuagint does more of that, adds stuff that's not in the P source?
Yeah, it seems to make a lot of changes to P in the J area. So like this whole section is J, okay, starting at beginning of 7.
Yeah, and it's doing what P did, yeah.
That seems to be something that a more Hebrew-oriented writer would have a motivation to do, rather than a more Hellenistically oriented writer working with the Septuagint would have a motivation to do. And to me, that seems to support the idea that the Septuagint is using a Hebrew text that had these additions already.
Well, it at least tells us that, whoever they were, they obviously wanted to stress at least in this case, the difference between clean and unclean.
Yeah, which is not that whole section. I mean, at first you're reading the Yahweh source in the Masoretic text.
Doesn't even talk about that.
Yeah. Okay, the blue is Yahwist. Okay. So yeah, they mentioned the Yahweh as 7 by 7 male and female. But it's not until the P source that they're talking about 2 by 2 clean male and female. But they brought, and it's not reflected in the other source. I mean, that's just something that seems created out of whole cloth and just stuck there. There's no other line that even resembles that particular line later on, I don't think, exactly word for word. Well, maybe there is. Okay, 2 by 2. Enter male and female. Well, it's kind of like a combination. So that's why it seems to be a harmonization to me, because it's using bits and pieces of the P source and sticking them over here in the J source in order to make it seem like it's more coherent, where the sources are not so distinct anymore because you've interwoven them even a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, so J definitely does talk about pure animals. Takes 7 pairs, man and his woman. And P talks about it too, same chapter, chapter 7, verse 8, of all the animals that were pure. So both J and P have knowledge of cleanliness laws.
No, the clean here is in J too, where it mentions in verse 8. That's all J.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They both are designating a difference between clean and
Oh, I see what you're
unclean.
saying.
Yeah, J and P are.
Okay.
I just realized I made another minor mistake discussing the passage earlier, and I brought that slide back up, what I just noticed. On my table, I have it right, but just when I was reading through it and discussing it, I said it wrong. On the third day, there's 2 units there, I mentioned that earlier, with a let there be and it was so, but neither unit has a direct action by God. We talked about earlier how the earth brought forth vegetation. It doesn't say, God made the vegetation. But in the previous unit, it doesn't say God made dry land either. That is also completely passive there.
I like all these name spelling differences. Methuselah.
Yeah,
I'll have Noe or No. Noe?
I guess no, I would say.
Cain with a K.
Well, one thing I noticed was kind of interesting is that in this genealogy from Cain, they talk about one of the sisters. Somebody had a sister. The sister of Tubal was Noema. Well, in the Greek, here's No, a female Noah. There's no Noah in this genealogy. Where he would be in this, the son of Lamech, a different Lamech supposedly. Lamech has different sons and a daughter named Noema, whereas Lamech has a son named No later on, which is interesting, I thought. It's how these different strands are coming from different tribal backgrounds and they're being interwoven. Just interesting. But there's something I wanted to show you guys. In the Masoretic text, they have Tubal Cain, right?
Yeah.
Ada and Zella, I think her name is. Here it's Ada and Sella. But in the Septuagint, it's just Tubal, not Cain. But in the Septuagint, following the first time that Tubal is mentioned, is and he was, which is interesting because that's Kai N, I believe it's pronounced, meaning and was, Cain. Is that possibly a corruption there where they were looking at the Septuagint and reverse engineering the Masoretic text because they had some corruption, but the Greek they were looking at had corruption, so they got Tubal Cain because they combined the conjunction and the verb in the Masoretic
text. Fascinating.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing, though, that can come up from dictated copying, where one person is reading the text and another person is writing it down to make copies.
Plus, look at the elements there. The only thing's missing is that one N-looking symbol, whatever that is.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting. It'd be very easy to put those together.
And out, yeah.
Tubal Cain there. The only trouble is he's mentioned then as Tubal Cain later on in the verse 23 at the end, where he has, and the sister of Tubal. The Masoretic text says, and the sister of Tubal Cain, so they would have to have repeated the same thing here. But it
looks like he did.
Well, there's no verb there in the Masoretic text either. It's just like the sister of Tubal, Noema. That's basically how you read it. But they might have just been harmonizing it because his name was Tubal Cain, so it must be a mistake here. We'll just fix that, and harmonize.
Possible.
So it's possible, yeah. It's not slam dunk or anything, but just interesting. I thought.
To me, I think the insertion of Cain instead of Cain there is probably a copying error in the Septuagint itself. There's a transmission error later on.
Yeah, who knows? Although I did get a laurel wreath for bringing that up on the podcast from Dr. Price. So.
Yeah, that's an awesome observation.
I didn't even know he was handing out laurel wreaths, but I got one that day. But I was hoping to find out a lot more interesting tidbits like that by doing this, so I think it's worth it.
Are you going to give us copies of this, or have you given us a link already?
No, when I'm done, I was going to create a Kindle version of it and sell it.
Oh,
Be
that sounds
volume
good.
1. Yeah, I'll
Okay.
do Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua.
Yeah, it looks fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Just I haven't worked on it in about a month or two. Well, actually, the last time I worked on it, I went through it and cleaned up some stuff and made some changes, this and that, made things more consistent, but I haven't actually did any more translating.
So can
It's a
I
lot of work.
segue into another question that combines discussions from a couple of the different hangouts, since we got some of the same people here anyway?
By all means.
Because in one of the other hangouts, we're reading Gunkel, and he's one of the founders of form criticism. I'm curious how we define form criticism, and in what ways is what I've been presenting a type of form criticism? Because what I'm showing is just stylistic things, stylistic comparisons, which is kind of not the same thing that Gunkel was doing.
Who is the other person you mentioned?
I didn't. I mentioned just Gunkel.
But you said that it's not the same thing Gunkel's doing compared to who?
What I was doing myself.
Oh, yeah.
Do they both fall under the umbrella of form criticism, or should one of them be called something different?
I think what you were just doing could fall under the umbrella of form criticism, because you're looking at the literary motifs to an extent, or literary patterns of a section. So I think that would count. I mean, because that's the whole point of form criticism, looking at the literary nature of sources.
Yeah, not only that, they wanted to get down to what was the original text, and that's part of what your project involves, right?
Not really a project, it's just an observation, but yeah.
Well, it turned into a project.
Yeah, short one.
Yeah, I'd say that definitely falls under the umbrella of form criticism.
Yeah, there's a lot to form criticism. I mean, there's genre analysis, all kinds of weird stuff going on. As what kind of literary form is it? Parable, what else they got? Poetry and stuff like that. So that's part of it too. And if you're looking at trying to find chiastic structures, you're looking at it poetically, which I think is a very good way to approach the text.
Yeah, I wish my memory was better. I have a hard time remembering details. And since I couldn't find a good way to present it that was compatible with what I was presenting here with the color coding, I don't have the chiastic stuff shown here. And my memory is bad. I can't remember where they were in order to discuss them properly.
That's one thing that when Gunkel said that all of Genesis is prose except for chapter 49, I was thinking that to myself, like, well, yeah, Genesis 1 does kind of seem poetic. I mean, it has a poetic structure to it.
Yeah, and I think things do actually come in doublets and triplets. But I think the test needs to be done in the Hebrew, though, and not necessarily in the English translation, because the English translation can merge different clauses together into one sentence in a way that breaks out the previous divisions of the text.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I like seeing those patterns, or, those things color-coded like that. That was interesting.
If I find a way to show where I think the doublets and chiasm is, maybe I'll make a new presentation about that later.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
I just need to figure out a way to visualize it on here.
All right, guys, I'm gonna hit the hay. That was fun. It was fun having Acharya in here.
Yeah, that was great.
Before you go, I'm going to post a link to that one thing I mentioned earlier where it was talking about the poetry of Genesis. There's the link to it.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, okay, cool. I'll read this.
Yeah, he's done translation of Genesis and Exodus. I think that's he might have gotten Leviticus done. what he calls the mechanical translation of Genesis, and it's a very very odd translation. Dr. Price would love it. I sent him a link to it because he loves those offbeat translations. But Genesis 1, for instance, the guy translate, in the summit, the powers fattened the sky and the land. That's his translation of Genesis 1. That got me thinking, in the summit, isn't that kind of like when on high? Like the Innomine Elish? Because they're both construct state. And if, the word beginning can also mean like summit, first, head, top.
Mm-hmm.
So why not on
Yeah.
high? It's like, so you could translate, it's like, when in the heights the gods, Elohim, created the heaven and the earth. You could translate it theoretically kind of like in the more so towards the Enuma Elish and get away with it, I think.
That does make sense, although there's also the point of view that Genesis is trying to distance itself from that kind of myth, and it's basically saying, the beginning starts here. There wasn't all this conflict between gods, prior to this beginning that I'm specifying.
Yeah, and apologists go out of their way to say that we're talking about absolute beginnings here, whereas most critical scholars accept that we're talking about a primordial chaos that pre-existed creation. So, right away it becomes an apologetics issue.
Yeah, I definitely see the primordial chaos here. Yeah, that's undisputable.
Well, if you read like the New English translation and Net translation, they have extensive notes to it, and they have a very elaborate footnote about how it should not be taken any other way except an absolute beginning. So
Yeah.
it depends on your denomination, I guess.
There's another point of view from old Earth creationists that I think their idea is kind of crazy. I don't really want to support it at all, but they basically say that God, created the heavens and the earth, and then later on it became formless and void, and
Yeah,
then
like in the
this is all a
space of between the
recreation
verses.
afterwards.
Yeah, and they claim it takes place in the space of that verse.
Yeah,
Which, if you want to read into it, then you're doing a fine job of doing it.
I've heard too them say like days 1 through 5 happened pretty much back to back in sequential order, but then there was a like 4.5 billion year delay when you get to day 6.
Yeah, Reuben says he's familiar with Jeff Benner. Yeah, I had some correspondence with him too. He's a nice guy.
There's one guy who is an old Earth creationist. I forget his name, but I watched a couple of YouTube videos with him debating young Earth creationists, and he's an astronomer. Oh man, he just destroys them. It's hilarious. The only weakness I think he had in his arguments was talking about the flood, like him trying to argue that the flood was just regional. He was just really struggling with that. But everything else, he was like, when it came to the definition of what does a kind mean, how how specific can the kind mean? Like the word kind, I forget exactly what it is in Hebrew, but it could have it could encompass a broad group of different things, or it could be used for a specific one type of thing. Like somewhere, I forget which book it's in, like Genesis or Exodus, it talks about different kinds of owls, not just different kinds of birds, but different kinds of owls, and use the same kind word. But anyway, sorry to bore you guys with that, but he's really good.
No, we don't want to keep you, Jeff. You said you were going to leave anyway.
Hey, my name's not Jeff.
one thing I'd like to discuss at a future hangout, but which I don't have enough material on, I'll have to have you guys help me get examples, is how Genesis and the other books of the Torah connect with later books of the Old Testament, like all the tie-ins between Genesis and Ezekiel, or between Genesis and Jeremiah. And according to the documentary hypothesis, these tie-ins tend to be with particular sources and not others, which is part of what makes it so fascinating.
Okay, guys, I'm out of here. Good hangout.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Wayne, for making
As
those
usual.
slides
You're
up
welcome.
too. I liked seeing them laid out like that.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Really good work.
Thank you.
All right, take care, guys.
Night.
Good night.